Yeah. So it is my great honor to welcome Yoreshet Ruach D'vorah Grenn to be joining us today. Dvorah has been a light in the world, the realm of the goddess, for decades now, doing really important academic research and also this circle act of inviting more women into this work and lifting up their voices and doing it in community. And so I've really been touched by all of our experiences together, all of the exposure that I've had to you and to your work. And the way that you personally have reached out your hand to me to invite me into the different forums where you speak about the goddess and teach about the goddess. And so I want to really thank you for that. And and it's a joy to like be, kind of bringing you into this circle and this audience that is growing. And so I wanted to just open it up and ask if there's anything, there's so much about you, and even just reading into your bio and all the things that you've done is so robust and profound. I wanted to say, like, as you open up to new audience and new ears, in an introduction, what would you most want them to know about you?
A wonderful way to do the introduction. Thank you. Less embarrassing than a litany of accomplishments. And also, I appreciate what you've said and have also appreciated your receptivity and openness to our collaborating. One of the ways that we came together, Miriam knows, of course, is when I was doing a women's leadership program, really an intuitive leadership program through my Lilith Institute. And I was so struck by the shin that Miriam painted that's behind her, and the fact that it represents fire and that it is my colors in addition to that, but fire while I was teaching Lilith, which is much of the time. I was very grateful to be able to have that on some of our literature and expose more people to it, which I hope to do about your podcast and your emergent work together, because it's very exciting, and I can't wait to hear more about each of you and how this collaboration all started. So is there anything I want to say? There's so many places I could begin. I guess I'll say one important piece for this particular podcast, I think, which is how did I come to the goddess, and how did that happen? And it was after two deaths in my life of people I was very close to, the second of which I witnessed. And so going through that kind of trauma just broke me open. And I think I had no choice but to hear her and to listen. And I also was seeing some literature at the time that I don't know how I saw it, but things like Shakti Woman by Vicky Noble and um, Women Who Run with the Wolves, where she writes in the introduction, yeah, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, a classic, of course, as you know. Just even in the introduction, reading things that so struck me, like, if your spirituality is squashed, then so is your creativity. And given the kind of marriage I had come out of, that really hit me as very true, really rang true. Of course, Vicky writes about Lilith, but about us and the Shakti that we all hold as women in our bodies, and Jean Shinoda Bolen. Yeah, every woman, the goddess is every woman. So those three things came up for me when I was in corporate America, and as a VP of corporate communications, living a very different life and very cut off from myself and very linear and very even male identified still at that point. And so it felt like she kind of hit me over the head and said, wake up. I also read about a goddess movement in California. And I thought, well, that makes perfect sense, because if we're created in God's image, then of course God has to be both male and female, have both aspects. And the only goddesses, like many of us that I'd heard of, were Venus, Aphrodite, those who were co-opted by the Greeks from Mesopotamian deities. And that was all I knew. And so it just made sense to me. And then my next exposure to it, when I decided to pick up and leave my corporate life and move out to California, where I had family, my first let's say, real life exposure, other than my own sense of it, was at Z Budapest's Goddess Spirituality Forum Festival, in one of those that she did in Santa Cruz. And that just blew me away. That just, I can't even describe the feeling in my body of seeing all these women at one point in the festival, which went for a weekend, wrapped around a mother drum, one of those earth drums that you see, larger than you would even see at a powwow, giant drum with at least 15 women drumming on it. That, experiences like that, which were out of my wheelhouse, just really brought me in touch with her and the earth. I'm feeling like energy from my feet to the floor of my office at the moment, just remembering what that all felt like. And also, although I'd written about Lilith in the 80s because of hearing about her in a class, and for the first time meeting such a character in Jewish literature, again, real life, how I met her was when Cozy Fabian of blessed memory gave a talk. And one of the first things she said was, "I live Lilith." And she did. And she talked about that. And I was forever entranced and committed, I suppose, even though she comes and goes through my life after my thesis, which became the book Lilith's Fire, and the creation about that same year, 97. Also, I feel her very much as one Lilith Institute of Inanna Lilith Ishtar. She comes in and out of my life. Why, although the more strongly see this, but the figure that you may know from the British Museum, when I was doing the thesis, I asked one of my committee members, who was a Jungian feminist Royal Authority, for me, that will always be Lilith, who wrote much of that's how I was translated figure, working with other people. For many other people, including some very close literature and wise colleagues, it's Inanna Ishtar, no question about it in their minds. So around 4000 BCE, I said, could it be that she's an aspect? And she thought there was no reason why not. And of course, we call Goddess she of 10,000 names. We know she is not just one thing. And so Inanna Lilith Ishtar, I'm comfortable with that, and several more names.
Wow.
I don't want to
eating you up, like so much wisdom and so much resonance with kind of the little breadcrumbs we've been following. And there are so many places to dive in, but one of the things is you were sharing how you came to the goddess that feels really alive for me, and I think us personally, is kind of that fracture that you're speaking to, that's happened both with all of these archetypical figures, but maybe began in that separation of us from nature and then therefore us from each other, and kind of all the ramifications of that out. And it feels like, or at least we're hopefully tuning into this time when it does feel like the goddess is returning from exile in and through so many women who are starting to reclaim that power and that lineage and that connection. And for the three of us, our own work kind of really emerged from grappling with the fracture in our own lineages and past, and from Miriam's Jewish upbringing to I was raised very devoutly Roman Catholic, as was Sarah, and feeling this need to not simply reject those patriarchal institutions that have certainly caused so much wounding and damage, but this acknowledgement that the goddess, while exiled, is still in the subsoil, buried beneath and beyond and behind all of those kind of twists and perversions of her stories. And there's been this longing to reclaim and kind of collect all of these fragments in ways she's been masked or hidden, to find some kind of living spirituality again. And Lilith herself, as we started to work with some of the archetypes, it feels like especially those which have been most othered, which have been, as patriarchy made an ever more limiting kind of face that the goddess can wear as only the virgin or only the mother, to really be coming into the wholeness of those most repressed and turned into kind of fearful, demonic, unallowed aspects of the goddess and ourselves feels like a real key. And as we were doing kind of our first program together, surprisingly, we were kind of working through this larger cycle of maiden, mother, and crone. And in Maiden, actually, was when Lilith came through to the forefront of that original, like, the old name of virgin is in beholden to no man, she who which would not submit. And that sovereignty of her was really powerful. And we all kind of had this intuition that I would love to hear more from you. You know, in the story, she's often the demonic one who steals the babies. And we had this encounter with her where she's actually the one who swoops in and picks up and protects those wounded in other parts of ourselves, our own inner little ones. And she's been such a force for us as we kind of come into finding our own way, and would love to hear more about your relationship with her specifically, and if any of that resonates in terms of that fracturing and othering that's so important to kind of reclaim.
Yes. I first want to say, especially since you've said that you're both Catholic, Mary Magdalene is similar, right? In the way she's been othered and demonized and is now being brought back and honored, right? And celebrated in so many ways. The literature is just amazing what's coming out, the Megan Watterson series and, Magdalene Rising and all of these wonderful books. So I just want to call that out. And because I think as we become more aware of demonization of archetypes, we become more aware of how it's happening. We have something to grasp onto to identify what's happening to some of us and some of our friends and people we read about in the paper. And the woman who gets fired because she had an affair with her boss, but he's never the one fired, this kind of thing that continues. I think for me, she is, and how I wrote about her in Lilith's Fire, the second part of that was reclaiming our sacred life force. It's not a novel about her. It is a story rather about meant to be accessible to everybody. It's not an academic work, but to point out the dangers of following the dogma of organized religion too closely without weighing in about your own opinions, being careful about who you trust to hand over spiritual authority to, because with all the abuses we've seen across organized religion. And so I wrote about her and always still do, and it's all over my website, as I'm sure you know, viewing her as somebody who can inspire and model for us not only independence, but an open sexuality, an unashamed relationship with one's own sexual preferences is implied, I hope, risk-taking, being unafraid to take, willing to take, maybe afraid, but willing to anyhow to take the risk to leave so-called paradises, which may in fact be prisons and very negative and damaging for us situations. And the fact that her anger, like the anger of Kali Ma and others, is on behalf of others. It's a righteous or rightful rage, I often call it, because it's on behalf of those who, not just her, but those who can't speak for themselves. So I also want to mention Nikki Marmory's novel, Lilith, which I don't know if you've come across yet, but it's lots of fun, speaking as and through characters. And I'm not usually a reader of novels, but this one's a lot of fun. So I think, yeah, those are some of the qualities. And no doubt when I first heard about her, the reason she so lit me up is that I recognized my own need for independence and the fact that I wasn't fully taking it. I mean, since you asked that question, where she lives in me, it's, yeah, I haven't said that before, but it just strikes me that had to be, what first attracted me to her. Here was somebody not afraid to speak her mind, and who didn't get punished for doing so. Well, they tried to punish her. The angels tried to punish her, right? By telling her when she left Eden that she'd have demon babies, or that 100 of her babies would die each night, or that she'd be barren, depending on which translation you read. And she struck a deal with them, as you probably know, that she'd not go back to Adam. That wasn't happening, which is what they were trying to get her to do. But that if they put an amulet with her name on it next to a baby, she wouldn't harm the baby or make them sick. Yeah. So most of the amulets you see in many parts of the world, I think especially Middle East, will say, they'll call in Adam and Eve, but then say out Lilith. Mm. Yeah. And her name still has such power that somebody I interviewed, I think he called himself a Persianist. I mean, he was a scholar at Cal Berkeley on Iraq and Iran. And so we were talking, and he mentioned a trip he had made to the Orthodox section of Jerusalem, where he'd been with a family for dinner and noticed there was an amulet against Lilith on their wall. And he commented on it. This is, I think, after or before or after they denied having any superstitions, of course, or believing in her. But when he said, "But you have an amulet against Lilith," they right away said, they got very upset that he uttered the name because that could call her in their minds, I'm sure. So the belief in her and fear of her is still very strong. And of course, again, across the board, we see this. It boils down to a fear, men's fear of women's sexuality or power to seduce instead of their own inclinations. There is a book with a great title called Rabbinic Fantasies that I used in my research. And it's really about, because men obviously are having trouble controlling themselves, they had to have this figure to blame for wet dreams and so on, and sexual urges. And I just have to say one more thing. It's very much, I think, underneath all the horrible things that are happening to women of the wall, who have been fighting valiantly for at least like 35 years to be able to pray at the wall in the same way that the men do, to bring in a Torah, to chant loudly, to sing and pray loudly. And they are sneaking things in, but they get checked by security. They've had chairs and much worse thrown at them. They've been imprisoned. Anat Hoffman was one of the early founders, and I'm so grateful to them. They really deserve our support because they continue to pray there. And they've even snuck women and young girls to get their bat mitzvah at the wall. So they've snuck in miniature Torahs. I mean, it's really amazing what they've managed to do. And now they are having good support, I think, for praying at a different section, but it's kind of outside, away from the main part of the wall, but their own section to pray in. So it's a compromise, but it's still really infuriating that they have such a problem being at the main section. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you're talking about the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall in Jerusalem, the
Thank you.
holiest
Yes.
site for Jews.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, I'm struck by this story of the negotiation between Lilith and the angels upon her refusing to submit to Adam. And I'm wondering if Lilith is maybe the figure for our times in looking at how we are emerging from this place where patriarchy wanted to tell women how to be and how to suppress themselves. And now, as we're coming into this place of re-emergence where women are being less demonized, maybe somewhat, right? Our freedoms may be increasing.
Yeah.
And I mean, there is tamping down in very visible ways, but there's also a lot more awareness about it and awareness that it's not right, which wasn't always there on the surface. And so I'm wondering about your journey over these decades, because I know for me, even just in the past 10 years, as I discovered the goddess coming out to, as one who loves her and sees that, women are divine and we are priestesses and we have this capacity. That was a rough journey in this century even. And so what has this been like for you in watching all the different social patterns and responses to you as a strong woman who was embracing the goddess?
Hmm. Well, it certainly lost me some friends. There were people I couldn't talk to when I was studying women's spirituality because they just thought I had landed from Mars when I tried, in my excitement to explain what I was learning about. Um, and that the first writer was a woman, and the fact that we actually created agriculture and math and all these things. Yeah, there's not a whole lot of people you can talk to about these things without them thinking you're crazy or just shying away. As Northstar is sort of indicating, I've seen that. That's how I'm seeing the body language. It may not be how you intended it, but there is, and that gesture also makes me think of the pushback that is happening now. So yes, it's been very exciting and felt very much that we're at the edge, which is where change happens, of course, but it's just not always a comfortable place, especially socially. And I remember Cozy talking about that, but that's where change happens. And so as exciting as it's been, it is that much more upsetting to see what's happening now, because I think so much of it is pushback to the feminist movement, to the fact that the things that we hold dear, like human rights, that many men hold dear with us, are being called woke, or which many people I think don't even have a real definition for. They just know they want to be on this side, not another side. So I think for people who were aware as the feminist movement grew and as the third wave happened and so on, it was exciting. But for many of us, like myself, who were still male identified, it was something we kind of distanced ourselves from, I think. I mean, I'll tell you one example for myself. Walking back to my executive office one day on Fifth Avenue, I passed a table where two women were shouting out against Penthouse magazine and had a picture of a horrible cover, which I don't know if you've ever heard of, where there was a woman as if she's going through a meat grinder. All you could see was a meat grinder and her legs. It wasn't an active thing, but it was an image that was pretty horrendous. And of course, our bodies are treated like meat, are treated in horrendous ways. And all that did was embarrass me. It was like, what are they showing that for? And no empathy, no compassion, or any understanding of why this was important that they were doing it. It was just something that I wanted nothing to do with, and I just kept walking, and living my life. But so things like that, I've been really ashamed of when I look back later, because I have a younger sister. She's almost 5 years younger, and she was a feminist long before I was. And yet I hyphenated my married name. And so people said, "Oh, are you a woman's liber?" Which was always an accusation. So of course I would deny it, not realizing how deep it ran, and that, yes, it was underneath everything. And, moments when I felt unexplained anger, well, I'm sure that that's what was at the core. So I don't know for sure I'm answering your question, Miriam. You're asking more like, what was it about in like 20 years ago, 30 years ago?
Well, just as you've been evolving, and you for sure are.
Okay.
And yeah,
Yeah. Because I
anything.
missed part of the movement in a way. I feel like I didn't do consciousness raising for whatever reason. And I think it was probably because I left California, where my family had moved me to, back to New York, and just was involved with building a career, and I was pretty narrow, in my focus, I think, about that. So didn't have women's community, which is the other thing I just need to say, that how important it is and how wonderful it is that you're forming this as a collaboration. I love that, because I have a couple of women I'm close with. We collaborate, and we've made a conscious point of talking about how important it is for women to stop competing and rather collaborate, because that's a male-driven, a misogynist fixture, to try to divide us. So yeah, so now it's a very odd time, and it's a time which is obviously very upsetting, that part of the country wants to see Handmaid's Tale reenacted, it seems, and the other part is fighting more strongly than ever and is more unified than ever. So it's a very fractured time, really. Don't you find?
Yes. So overwhelmingly so. And that's kind of a follow-up question that I was hoping you could speak to, maybe even on a personal level, of how do we resource courage to keep walking this path when there's so much backlash? And you having been a pioneer in this for so long, when, yeah, as it may be getting easier, and there's also, in some sense, an intensification of that reaction too. And I think we all find in ourselves there's, on the personal levels, especially from our background, that fear and backlash of the deep programmings from the way we were raised, not only maybe, family members overtly not understanding or having judgment, but recognizing within ourselves. And a lot of our work has been around kind of rooting out that deep conditioning that instills in our and puts on us that own kind of internalized oppression of shame and guilt, or
Absolutely.
believing, that we've been doing a lot of work with kind of the curse of Eve, as we've internalized that doctrine of original sin, and that somehow we are fallen, or our sexuality is bad or wrong. And I'm curious, on a personal level and through your work, how you've been able to work through that and keep showing up in a public way, and being, kind of holding this torch in a time when there's so much backlash from outside. And if you've experienced it also on the inside, of how these kind of old lies and stories live in us.
They don't go away entirely. I think that we can silence their voices a lot, but they will still sometimes pop up. But that's one of the gifts of aging, that we recognize it faster, I think, if we're doing our work. So I think that's number one. We have to do our own work, and that is often not comfortable. It can take people, I know some people it's taken till they're 60, 70, even one woman in her 80s, till they feel safe enough or secure enough to recognize some of what they went through and name it. I think women's community, again, I can't stress that strongly enough. At least one or two really solid friends, but better yet, circles that we can take part in are critical, because then we have people to reflect back, even if we don't always agree, but to reflect back what the situation is. Because if we're getting gaslighted, and we still are, if not by government, by a partner. I was certainly gaslighted by my husband several times that I can recall, and some that I don't, because I know I've suppressed them so deeply. So personal note is that I kept marriage journals, a couple of marriage journals, and I have found things in there now that I finally, about starting 8 or 10 years ago, was able to go back to them. I couldn't even open them before. And the first time I did it with a friend who's a witness and a writer, so that I start to write my own response to some of this. And then eventually a couple of articles came out of some of the things, the power imbalance and verbal abuse and so on, that came out of that. Also, that takes me off, not a tangent, but another thing I wanted to say, that I was an advocate against domestic violence when I moved out here. I had finally the time and the ability, because the other training was in the Bronx at night when I lived in Manhattan. So I couldn't do a training there. It wasn't very practical. I would have taken 3 hours or 2 hours just transportation to get the training. So as soon as I came out here, I signed up for that. And it was a 40-hour training, and it was one of the most empowering things I ever did. So if anybody's in that kind of situation, or they think they might be, that is a really good thing to do. And I was given language in that training for something called verbal abuse and emotional abuse that I knew I was experiencing, but I had no language for. So I didn't fully identify it, without partly maybe thinking I was crazy, or that it wasn't that bad. That's something that women often will tell themselves. So I did that, and I was an advocate and staffed a hotline for as long as I could, and then moved up to where I am now in the North Bay. And because a lot of the laws had changed, this was about 15 years later, I had to do the training again. And also this local group had taken over the local sexual assault group. So that was another 20 hours of other things you had to learn. So 60-hour training, still 15 years later or more even, very empowering, very educational, very informative, learning that there are things that can happen to children who witness abuse or themselves are abused in some way, that become manifest as physical illness later in life as adults, that you don't know that there's a source, and that's the source. So I think that's been part of my work too. And I think Lilith would have certainly been such an advocate. Yeah.
That's beautiful. As a former nurse, hearing you speak on how those traumas can really manifest in our body and become almost like sometimes autoimmune or other formations down the line. It's really beautiful to hear. And I'm wondering, for someone who might be feeling really alone right now. I know we've talked about community and having our circle. I know for the three of us, Miriam, Northstar, and I, we have this rule of just saying the next hardest thing and having that space where we can really reflect on what's something that you find might be the next hardest thing for you to say when it comes to Lilith right now.
When it comes to Lilith,
Or just in general, but Lilith
hard.
might come up there.
In general.
What's something that seems edgy?
Oh, that's different. Okay, because the hardest thing, is not to tell some men off, I think, at times.
Yes.
Or some of the women, who come up with these statements, but mostly, yeah, to channel my anger in appropriate ways, I guess. Edgy. I don't know that any of it's edgy. It's just awareness, trying to be aware. For me, edgy is I'm in a program in which I am asked to do more meditation. So doing silent meditations for half an hour, let's say, or longer, can be challenging, but very productive. and shorter periods of silence have become part of my practice. So I think that's really important. And I think being aware of the dangers of isolation are also important. That's not an edgy thing. It's just something that I want to say because you mentioned isolation.
Yes.
And when I was first married, my husband said, oh, we don't need anyone else. Well, that was very romantic, right? And many women, I think, still go for that kind of thing. And so I want to also mention the myth of romantic love that we were raised with and probably is still very alive today. Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
dangerous. So dangerous. Oh, we don't need anyone else. We have each other. Well, that's great for the first year, maybe. But even then, if you start losing friends and contact, deadly. I think can be deadly. Not necessarily, but dangerous. Even if you're not in an abusive marriage, if you're in a great relationship, it still cuts off part of your own development, I think, and growth to let go of friends. And for some people who are more introverted and maybe don't really want to come out and be part of a circle, to just be part of community in some way. And I guess maybe that's one of the advantages of holding circles on Zoom, although as Miriam knows, I feel sometimes it feels very weird, but it works. We've been able to do ritual, and you all know this, successfully on Zoom, and I am grateful for that. So I think probably that has opened up more opportunities for introverts, not because I want them to turn off their camera, but they don't have to, we always say, and I think you probably do too, if you pose a question, you don't have to comment, you can pass. I never make anybody respond to a particular prompt, right? It's up to them. But usually people who come will do, but some people pass because they're just not comfortable talking online or off, So I'm starting to want more in-person interaction, and we're doing locally, we're doing a day-long workshop on mystical practices, ancient and modern Jewish mystical practices, which is going to be a lot of fun. Yeah.
I wanted to seize upon this piece that you were saying, that you were holding yourself back from, telling off men or whoever it was saying something, and say, like, if you were to embody the truth that you would most want them to know and to speak from that place, what is it that you would say to them?
Probably nothing that isn't being said by women all over the country and that we read about, such as women's rights are human rights. You have no right to tell a woman what to do with her body, obviously. Um, uh, um, Domestic violence breeds in silence was a bumper sticker I once had. And I'm thinking about silence today. It makes you, it's an old expression about it makes you complicit if you're not speaking out against something. And I would say that to women too, who have no desire, let's say, to, raise their voice about what is right, because not everybody wants to march in the streets or is able to do that. There are many types of activism. And I think right now, especially with what's going on in LA and San Francisco, it is not okay to just sit back and do nothing. I think petitions aren't necessarily very helpful, but there are more and more forums, I think, where one can make one's voice heard, like writing letters to the editor and so on. But as important or more important, talking to family and friends, even when that's really hard. And that's something that I guess that for me is edgy, that is still and has been since, the anti-vaxxers started talking, and when we started with COVID and so on, being able to have hard conversations with people with whom we don't agree. That's, I guess, one of my edges for sure. And it's something I need to learn to do better and not be afraid to do. Because I think that Lilith piece, that I'm probably afraid I may blow up. And so I probably have avoided one conversation in particular I can think of. And yet I should probably call this woman up and, say, let's have coffee. But I know we kind of tried to talk once before, and it was really very, very difficult. And it was about the current and past president. So,
Yeah.
Yeah. But we have to find ways to do that. And I would especially like to ask some of these people, who are in severe disagreement about and doing the woke thing. What do you think woke means?
Yeah.
and break that down, because I think a lot of them are just parroting what they hear as the bad guys, on the left, and they don't understand that a lot of our interests may be the same, especially as parents, or siblings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
That's right. One of the key pieces that we work with is the Vesica Pisces, or another word for it is Mandorla, but this idea that, we may have two polarized opposites, and right now the world is so polarized and so stuck in those opposites, but that when we move them together and we find that point of convergence, that's where everything opens up. And that point of convergence is a vulva shape, right? It's like that pathway
Venn
into the realm
diagram.
of God. Yeah,
Young
Yeah.
exactly.
diagram. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Inanna, by the way, teaches us to hold paradox, as do many of the goddesses. She can rage, but she can also be loving and sensual, and constant holding a paradox. It's something that Judy Grenn writes about a lot as well. Yeah.
That's true. And that reminds me of, when we first meet her, rather than brandishing her sword, she shows her beautiful vulva, which is that, Vesica Pisces, that space where paradox meets.
Right, right. And then a short time, I think later, or maybe earlier, she has taken, while her uncle or grandfather or whatever his relationship with her is, which is always up for discussion, the powers of civilization, the May, right? She has taken those and won't give them back when he sobers up and asks for them back. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. So all of that, yeah, being able to hold all of that and not lose ourselves in temper, but to be able to temper ourselves in ways so that we have that balance. It's a lot of what we teach I teach, as I think Miriam, Tree of Life class for several years now, and every year with Reb Nadia Gross, and it's all about balance. Balancing like your chesed, your love, and your quality of mercy, your loving kindness, with your gevurah, the need for boundaries and discernment, and what happens when one is out of balance. Yeah. By the way, I don't know if you're both in East Coast,
Mhm.
Northstar, yeah, and Sarah?
Northstar is
I'm in
Sarah.
Canada.
Okay.
I'm a little
Northstar?
bit. Yeah, sort of. Well, like Toronto area.
Uh-huh. And Northstar, where are you?
I'm in central New York.
Okay. Okay.
Are you coming out this way?
Coming to Boston, we're starting a wisdom school where we'll be doing an introduction to the Tree of Life as an intensive in September, one weekend, 4 days, and then 3 meetings online over 3 months, for 2 hours. And then if people want to immerse more deeply, they'll get the program I was lucky to have in 2013, which is an immersion for 18 months, which will be a hybrid program. So I'm excited about that, and I didn't want to forget to mention it because, yeah, Miriam, I'll be closer to you. Yeah,
It'll be fun.
Northstar maybe.
Yeah,
Amazing.
it'd be great
Well, I
to
have a
see.
friend to stay with in Boston.
Yeah,
You
Like,
sure do.
here we come, Miriam, sleepover.
Woohoo.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, maybe you can, for me personally, I'm so interested, please share. And we can also in the show notes put a link if you have more information about that.
Sure,
It'd be
sure.
amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a thread I want to pick up from what you just shared because it feels so kind of crucial, not only to these times, but also seems like an iteration of that fracturing we first talked about and how the goddess and the story of the goddess in Western culture and through patriarchy has been this such overt expression of what happens when we only take, say, what's perceived as the light, the virginal, the queen of heaven, and we cut away the sensual and the sexual and the reality of the need for destruction. And
Right.
when for me, goddess culture, or the vestiges of a matrilineal way of life, was so in tune with cycles and recognizing the cycles of nature as they manifest in our own bodies, the cycles of the moon, that it isn't a duality of good versus bad, but it's a beautiful interplay of the relation between all of these aspects and parts and phases. And I feel like as we have experienced kind of the aftermath generationally of what happens when patriarchy takes men and puts them in a position of power over women, takes, spirituality and divorces it from physicality and puts them at odds. That splintering and fracturing is such a deep schism in our psyche. And yet, in these times of reclaiming that, how easy it is to revert back to kind of spiritual materialism. Or there's a lot of, in the new age, I recoil a little of that, we're just going to love and light and not engage with the realities of being on an earth plane in the trials and tribulations and the necessity of that. And so one of the things that inspires me most about you, and I'm so thrilled to learn from you and your journey over all of these years, is that you have kind of all of these components, both the deep academic, well-researched history and knowledge base in a really grounded and just deep well of information and the kind of wisdom of the past, combined with that real direct revelation of embodied spirituality and ritual and ceremony and personal relationship with divinity. And then also that component that feels so necessary and challenging to navigate, because it is polarizing, of how do we show up and speak for justice and truth, and the work you're doing with domestic violence, with how do we actually have our spirituality apply in meaningful ways to our daily life without also perpetuating that othering of falling into the us versus them trap. And kind of there's a way in which I think the narrative that's often put upon us that makes us other a position or an ideology or orientation that doesn't enable that communion of when we see each other as humans and come together, maybe there is an opportunity for transformation and to learn something. And so, it's kind of a big multi-part question, but just curious how you have navigated and continue to navigate that balance of the spiritual as it manifests in your daily life, and how we both use that as a resource to engage while also not losing sight of the deeper connectivity and divinity in all beings, even when they're wildly seemingly on the other side of any particular issue.
Again, I think talking with people from whom we can learn, never stopping studying on some level, is, knowing what my partner calls me a perpetual student, which is okay. Because I think our instinct and intuition especially will tell us what we need to learn, and to not be afraid to do that, and to be willing to be, even if you're teaching, to also be a student is really valuable. To do constant self check-ins. I see a lot of journals now and books, obviously, that are talking about, give you all these ways to do it. And once you've seen 10 of them, you've probably covered the field. Some have more beautiful depictions of how to check in with yourself. Doing divination, I find to be really useful for myself as well as others. I do it, but doing it for myself on a daily basis. Definitely taking time to meditate, even though it's murder for some of us, to sit still. That is a male model too, the sitting still, the yogis who did that, the yoginis I know, the women who do it, they may also sit still. I definitely have some friends who go into silence sometimes for several days or part of a day. I challenged myself to go to a silence and stillness retreat a couple of years ago, just to see if I could do it. I did. So it would be the days in silence, and then the evening there was a teaching. So that was called more stillness, because we were able to talk then. So knowing that, I was able to sign up for it. But I did find being silent all day was very rewarding. And so now if I don't do it for at least part of a day, even if I'm cooking or I'm walking, it's much easier if you're walking or doing some activity. But if I'm not engaging with words or another person or even music, but just being in silence, it is very profound, I think, as a means of replacing and replenishing our energy. This whole question of resilience, which has gotten, they tell me, to be an overused word, but still really important as we try to do spiritual or any other kind of activism. I think going into silence gives us some of that energy, that strength back. to think about what it is we really want. What is the most important thing I should be doing today? And it is probably not what somebody else thinks I should be doing, right? It may be something I'm doing with someone else, but reassessing priorities, I think daily, to be sure that our time doesn't disappear, because I find that happening a lot.
Mm.
And of course, we've kind of lost, a lot of friends of mine and me, a sense of time since COVID. It's like it's Wednesday, but we think it's Sunday, occasionally, things like that. I don't know if that's true for you, but the whole sense of time and space can be warped. And so the last, I guess, 15 years or so, I keep Shabbat in some way. I keep the Sabbath, not in, all too often, not in a traditional way of setting a whole table, but at least lighting candles, at least taking time for some prayers. I do spiritual practice and prayers every day, morning and evening at bedtime. The bedtime Shema I find very, very helpful. But whatever the practice is for you, I was reading about Teresa of Avila yesterday and didn't realize quite the impact that she had. I knew how she talked to God and so on. And Mirabai Starr has a little book about her, but there's a lot of writing about her. And so I think to study other traditions is important, and to be able to, and open to taking lessons from any teacher. I think something you said made me think about that Tibetan, studying a little bit of Tibetan Buddhism or practicing with a teacher can also put things in tremendous perspective for us in terms of our time here now in the larger sense. And I'm learning a lot about that. Yeah. So I think there were other things I wanted to say, but I'll stop there at the moment. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You were asking me how I did certain things, but I think earlier you might have mentioned resilience. Oh, the light and love, I just wanted to say, has never been my road. And I think that probably some people have this idea of what woke is, are thinking about New Age practitioners. And I have a real problem with New Agey anything, as I do with cultural appropriation. But I think if we are mindful and deliberate, as Miriam has been in her practice and in her studying with a shaman before she would start to say that she would think to teach shamanic anything, she has the background, she has the study. People who devise something out of, I don't know what, but not necessarily studying with an elder, and then go out and offer to even make someone a priestess, in, I don't know, 3 months, or even a year, if they haven't had the training, that I think is a real problem. So really researching, and I'm sure you talk about this too, if you're going to study with somebody, knowing where they come from and who they've learned from and who they are crediting, because I also have tremendous issue with people who don't credit their elders, or sometimes also not their ancestors, but that there could be reasons for that. But to not say who you learned what you know from has never been something that I approve of, if I don't use that word easily, but it's really a problem.
Mm-hmm.
There are people doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll stop there with that point. Yeah. I'd love to know more about, how you all are working together, and how the goddess Grail came to be. But I don't know if this is the time for that, if we have time for that, or if you already have done that for your audience.
Yeah. Miriam, looks like you
Yeah.
want to say something.
Oh, yeah, we can take a moment. So I met Sarah in 2016, 2017.
Yeah,
We
2016, fall 2016.
2016. Yeah, so we did a 1 year shamanic apprenticeship in Peruvian shamanism and yoga. And we met out at Kripalu in Western Mass. And then Northstar and I met a year later in a 3 year core shamanism apprenticeship program. And, when you meet people who feel resonant, if you're lucky and mindful, you keep cultivating those relationships. And there was always a sense of there's work to be done here. But the understanding took years to kind of culminate and come to fruition. And so Northstar was my chavruta for years. We called it that, and like would do shamanic journey for weeks and
Great.
every week, and would emerge visions of what we were building. And some of these visions have not yet come to fruition. And then there was a clear calling to bring in Sarah and to start meeting. And we've become such a key part of each other's lives, even though we are distant over Zoom and in different countries. Even there's we've become an anchor for each other, and this concept of the goddess grail, of everyone having this energetic anatomy which holds the receptacle for the divine and the qualities of the divine, has come out really clearly for us. So we work in service to that, and service to the goddess in everyone, and her reemergence on the earth today.
I have to tell you, which I may have said to you already, Miriam, but when I first saw the words together, goddess and grail, it was wonderful just to see that, and it speaks volumes. So yeah, wonderful name.
It tethers into, I think, what you were sharing. And it's, I think one of the greatest tragedies in our history and continuing is that, as descendants and people who have been colonized and colonizers, when a colonizing force comes in, they kill the elders first intentionally. And we are living in somewhat of a vacuum in which so many of these lineages are broken through this intentional, both historically a literal killing of the elders, and the way our culture perpetuates that in our fetishization of youth and fear of old age, and the putting aside of our grandparents and not being in relationship. And I feel like it's kind of a weird thread, but it feels really alive to me as you were speaking, that part of what drew us together, and even to the goddess Grail, and the Grail having those connotations through having its own history in Western culture, and yet also speaking to this deeper vessel of the divine that's in our womb, that's in our energy body. There's this reclamation that I feel like we are stumblingly in service to, that at least in my own history, coming from such an intense patriarchal institution that in its enactment that caused so much harm and wrong, there was that desire to completely cut off, go another way. I went straight into Eastern traditions and yoga and Buddhism, and have kind of come in this full circle way of recognizing that we are all the inheritors of a lineage, of an ancestral story. And it has both trauma in it and medicine. And I think our work is not to walk away from all of that, but to unpack and heal and take these fragments and try and build something new out of. And as you were speaking, and I'm curious to hear a little more, because I feel like there's always this tension between being beholden to that which has been, and especially the ways it's been perverted and twisted and ingrained. And there is both this feeling at this time of a desire for the newness of that kind of direct revelation of what is coming through here and now us, and learning to trust our own intuition, and yet also the deep necessity to have it grounded in the elders and teachers and wisdom traditions that have come before. And I will wrap this up just in, I was blessed in my life to have the experience of really one true elder that I got to study with in a priestess initiation, who passed right after. And she was the one that really opened and taught me about ancestral work when I had such an aversion of not wanting to claim. And, the traditions I came from I'm against and wrong. And in her opening that door for me was really recognizing how interwoven the trauma and the medicine, and that we are not this lie of individualism that patriarchy has also uplifted, that somehow each of us on our own, that we are one thread in this massive tapestry that's so interconnected, and that we can't be doing our work without acknowledging and honoring and unnodding and reweaving the many streams that we emerge through and in relation with. And yeah, I feel like in her passing, the precipice I'm on and kind of open to the work that we're doing was this feeling in these times when so many of those lineages are broken, so many of those elders have been silenced and put aside, that in working with her now from beyond, I'm kind of called to put on shoes that are a little too big and walking around a little clunkily as a, a grandmother in training with many years and so much learning ahead. But how do we kind of with humility navigate that which is uniquely ours in relationship with both the challenging and beauty of that which is kind of set the container and paved the way?
You said it, with humility,
Mm.
but knowing that we have the capacity and the responsibility to carry forward the lineage.
Mm-hmm.
And it does feel daunting. And I wish I had more direct experience of my ancestors in terms of grandparents. Had my grandmothers for very little time and didn't know my grandfathers at all. And 4 generations before that, my father's side, Simon Silberstein, was a rabbi. And when I learned that, it really affirmed my becoming a priestess in some strange way. But, I just felt like, oh, I thought it was in the blood, and my father would never let me test his DNA because he was afraid of what they would find. And he was as honest a man as you could imagine, and humble, could be very humble. Although he was very strict with us, he could certainly be humble. And yeah, so I needed, because there was no precedent when I called myself a Kohenet, a Hebrew priestess. It was based, as Miriam knows, on the work that I and 2 other women were doing out here. And we knew, I mean, there was no modern day precedent, but we knew that women had been priestesses probably forever. But the only thing written about from 2,000 years, no, like 3,000 years ago, was that the wife or daughter of a priest in the ancient temple could be, didn't have to be, but could be, like had the right to be a priestess. Well, I figured there had to be people who were called to it, who were knowing it was in their lineage to do, or who were called by their community to perform some of the functions. And that's what we were doing. So I came out calling myself that in 2000, before there was any formal kind of ordination program that came about 6 years later, from a group that started an institute. But and now there are some who are ordained and some who are initiated. But I think we have to create our own containers also. In other words, if we take it all seriously, then we are carrying what parts of our lineage we can discover or feel. And again, I think a lot of that comes through not just prayer, but meditation. And if you study Buddhism, then you know that I think it must have the same goal as probably any mystical part of any tradition does, right? Whether it's Sufism or Jewish renewal or whatever it is. The idea that our yearning for God is in itself a connection, and that silent or some kind of meditation that we can do on a regular basis is often, I mean, for us in Jewish renewal, it's often geared exactly to that, to strengthening that connection with deity and the divine. And also, I think it spills over to that connection with ancestors, depending on how we direct our prayer and our thinking. And I think we listen, and I'm sure you all are doing that, we listen for the information in order to, how do we make this manifest now in this realm? And I think we also do some of it automatically or unconsciously. I find myself doing some things this year that were not part of my practice before. Nobody told me to do them. It just comes out of my own sense of holiness, I guess, or also intention and what I want to manifest.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it just can be, these days, especially, to calm ourselves down, to keep ourselves sane in an insane world. Because my biggest question several times in the last few years has been, how do we, even during COVID too, how do we take care of ourselves so that we can be spiritual leaders for others? And in fact, that gave rise to Tending Lilith's Fire, which was a broadcast I did for 2 years with another Kohenet, Annie Matan. And it was born out of that. priestessing the priestesses is what I first called it. And it was about that, how do we take care of ourselves so that we can lead others and teach them how to be resilient, how to do their work if we can't keep it together. And we're human, so we can't keep it together every day, every moment. We're going to fall apart. But we know we have lots of ways that we know now, resources to put ourselves back together. It may take longer than we'd like, but but it's going to happen. And I think there's also a lot of learning in the breaking apart. A lot of learning.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of this phrase as you were speaking of, we're not looking for perfection, we're looking for authenticity. And there's so much beauty in that falling apart. I know I've had so many people that have come through my life and they've shared that me being vulnerable has helped them also be vulnerable and step more into themselves. And those moments where we feel like we're crashing out on the floor, actually helping rise others up with us as we stand back on our feet. We're all interconnected, being able to hand in hand walk forward rather than, you know, what we think we might be doing. For me, there's never really this hierarchy. We're all on the same level. Someone just has a little bit more experience or wisdom than someone who's not yet walked that path. So, D'vorah, I wanted to thank you
Good
so
point.
much for being on the Goddess season of the Goddess. I almost said the Goddess Grail. It feels like a ceremony here. So I appreciate you so, so much. For those who are listening, is there any way they can connect with you? I know you have a website and you have something very special happening in Boston soon. So would you mind taking a moment and just sharing?
Thank you. Um, I just have to say one more thing to
Oh,
the last
yeah.
thing you said, if we
Yeah.
have time, and that is that, yeah, those meltdowns can be really important,
Mhm.
that we fear and that I never wanted to do. I never like to cry because, it's a weakness, but it isn't. It's a great portal. It can be a great portal.
Okay.
Anyway, D'vorah, they can write to me directly, DVORAH at lilithinstitute.com. The website is www.lilithinstitute.com. And I also this year created a Substack, and I'm happy to have guest contributors. So if somebody has a piece they've written that they'd like me to look at to possibly put on there, it's called Living Lilith on Substack. So that's lilithinstitute.substack.com. And I'm on Instagram, but less and less so. So direct email or texting can be the best way to get to me. Yeah. And I do intuitive oracle readings, and I do spiritual guidance sessions as well as teaching. But the teaching seems to always take over my life, and that's okay because the priestessing becomes part of the teaching. I recently did a class for Hebrew College called Women in Water, Creating Sacred Spaces, and how to bring the sacred rituals into our daily life.
Oh,
Because it's too easy to not, right, to let things go by if you only do it once a week. I think we need daily practice.
yeah, something in me just activated right up. So thank you for sharing. Thank you
Thank you
for
again for the
being here.
invitation. This has been a great
Oh,
conversation. I love it.
you're so welcome. And we'll put all those details in the show notes for anyone who's looking for them. And thank you again. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you not only for your generosity and sharing your time and wisdom with us today, but truly for all the work you've done these decades, paving the way for more of us to walk in those footsteps and bring the goddess ever more fully back home.
Need to do that. It's so good to meet you both, Sarah and Northstar.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you.
I
It's
hope we meet again very soon. And
yeah.
I feel like there's so much more I want to ask and
No,
know.
I know. I
So
want to say
maybe
to be
we'll
continued. Yeah.
be continued in another conversation or maybe in your workshop when you come out our coast.
Yeah.
Yeah.